This is Zach with a Quest for Greatness. This video is about upgrading your suffering. Not an upgrade you possibly want to make or have thought about making, but I'll explain that as Jesus suffered, so do we. Our channel is a Quest for Greatness. The whole of this channel is just to share what it means to have a relationship with God by talking about the truth, discussing that, looking for it, by sharing my life and the ups and downs and seeing Christianity in real time. And also it's about looking at and dispelling a lot of the myths that we as Christians hold. Look, part of the deal in Christianity is suffering. We all understand that. When you go to Matthew 16 and Jesus says anybody that's going to follow him has to deny himself. So you denying you means you've got to give up things. It means you got to go through things and endure things. And we'll look into that a little bit more about Jesus. But the idea behind this one is to upgrade your suffering. Doesn't sound like a sales pitch, but let me explain this to you. First of all, as I said, it's part of the deal. When you go to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 and you look at verse 3, Paul says that he wanted no one to be moved by these afflictions that they were suffering, for you yourself know that we were destined for this. They were destined for suffering. They understood that that was part of the equation. In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 29, Paul said, it's been granted to you that for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. His followers suffer with him. That's part of the equation. You and I should get used to that. And if you go to Matthew chapter 5 in verse 11 in the Beatitudes, Jesus said, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. And here's what he says afterwards, because it doesn't make any sense for you and me in human terms. Rejoice and be glad that you're suffering, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So if Jesus suffered, I mean, that was the whole of his identity, right? If you go to Philippians chapter 2, it talks about how we need to have the same mind as he does, or he did in verse 5, and then it talks about how much he suffered. Hebrews chapter 12 is where I am, and he says that look at Jesus, literally look to Jesus. If you're going to be faithful, look to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him, reason, endured the cross, despising the shame, and the seat at the right hand of the throne of God. Now, I got to remember that he suffered. And he tells me in verse 3 of Hebrews 12 to consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself. And if he's going to endure that, I need to remember that so that I don't grow weary or faint-hearted. That's the rest of the verse, which also leads me to a cross-reference here. In Matthew 10 and verse 24, Jesus says, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. If I'm the disciple, if I'm the servant, I got to remember this is part of the equation, just like it was for Jesus, and I'm not better than him. So before I start thinking about how bad life is and how difficult it is, this is part of it. And we're talking about upgrading. So let's look at that. All right, here's where that crazy title comes into focus. Because upgrade my suffering, what do you mean? All right, Peter wrote those two letters, 1st and 2nd Peter, to help them deal with what they were battling and suffering through already and what was coming. But he says this in 1 Peter chapter 3, now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? I think, well, you know, how many people are trying to harm me because of my righteousness, because of my Christian walk? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, do you identify with that? Do I? You will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ as the Lord is holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. A couple of questions there. Am I living in such a way that's so different from everybody else that it gives a reason for people to ask about the hope, or gives them a reason to make fun of me or give me a hard time because I'm so much different from them? He says, having a good conscience in verse 16, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. For it's better to suffer for doing good, if that should be God's will, than for doing evil. All right, let me make the point. James chapter 4, upgrade your suffering. Some of us are suffering, maybe a lot of us are suffering in our maybe Americanized Christianity, if I can call it that, because we have what they call first world problems. We're suffering through things that really don't even relate to our faith. How am I going to pay for this? How am I going to do this? How am I going to get to retirement? Things like that have nothing to do with our faith. And we say, oh, I'm suffering through that. those are not really spiritual problems. And we say, well, this is what I suffer with. Some of us need to upgrade our suffering and live in such a way that it will bring that rebuke, if you will, that reproach. James 4 and verse 1 says the following: what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You desire and you do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly to spend it on your passions, you adulterous people. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? What I mean by upgrading suffering is that I don't need to degrade what it means to suffer by thinking through my first world mentality of I have these problems, and because I'm worried or I'm concerned that I must be suffering for Christ. Some of us need to upgrade and live a life that other people are going to give us a hard time over, just like they did for Jesus. Not for that very purpose, I understand that, but that's what comes along. It's not that Jesus came here to be rebuked and to have a hard time and to suffer, but it came with the territory. When you live Christ-like, you automatically have to endure what goes on around you. Upgrade. Question of the video: is what you suffer because of mistakes that you make, things that you're doing wrong, or is it because of your righteousness, because you set such an example that people will give you a hard time? Do you suffer like Jesus, or do you suffer like the rest of the world?